Dear all, nice to see you after a pretty long summer break. Today I have the pleasure to talk with Dr. Jochen Kleinschmidt about Germany, its role in the security of Central Eastern Europe, and maybe a little bit about the contemporary domestic problems in Germany's politics. Jochen is a lecturer and a research associate at the chair of international politics at Dresden University of Technology. He is also an avid ex user and an analyst of security and international politics. Jochen, thank you very much for your time and for the conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Mateusz.
Okay, so let's get right in the thick of it. So for the last 10 years, I guess, I used to joke about how normally in Poland we will be fearing of German tanks, yeah, because of the all the history, the Second World War and all that. But then the funny thing is that we were more afraid that actually Germany doesn't have any tanks to help us out if the Russia starts to misbehave, quote unquote, right? So now with the Chancellor Merz talking about Germany's rearmament, with the whole EU apparatus providing financial instruments for that rearmament, and also Germany being the largest economy in the EU, right? The Germany rearmament is going forward. So the first part of the question is: will Poland start to fear German tanks again? But on the less jokingly, right? What is the talk? Just the talk. What is the real deal, and how much of the momentum for Germany's rearmament would be lost due to institutional inertia?
There are so many dimensions here. This really is a problem that has several levels. First of all, I don't think you will have to fear German tanks, at least not in the near future, because you have many more of them. Right? Poland has now, I think, 1,000 tanks and has also the manpower and the structure in place to staff them and operate them. In Germany, everything is more or less being established as we go. And it's not clear, for example, whether we can supply the personnel for all those ambitious plans, which are, of course, very justified in the view of the Russian threat. But with the demographic situation being as it is, and with less let's say, human reserves in the German labor market than in the Polish labor market, where there are many efficiency reserves, for example, in agriculture, and there are also immigrants who are considering coming back from countries such as the UK. All of that is more or less absent in Germany. So that will be one question, just one out of many, not necessarily the most important. That will be one thing to watch. Another question, and that is a more far-reaching one, is whether the planning is actually going in the right direction. There is actually an
Sorry,
emerging...
Jochen, but by planning, do you mean like the logistics of it, where to put the units, like what production lines to reopen or increase capacity, this kind of planning, or you mean more like political operational planning?
I mean the force plan, the character of the military force that will be established, because right now what we're seeing as the dominant mode of thought is that we're reconstructing the army of the Cold War.
Okay.
And that might not necessarily be adequate when we're looking at an enemy who is really more active or more competent in long-range strike than in tank battles. That is not something the Russian army will be engaging in, at least in the midterm. but we're very much looking at long range strike, unmanned systems, perhaps sabotage operations, and so on and so on. So that is a debate that Germany is not really having.
Okay.
Instead, we're reconstructing with new technology and so on, but we're reconstructing a concept that is from 1989 or around that.
But there are military analysts saying that the peculiarities of Russo-Ukrainian war are just that the war is pretty peculiar. Yeah, that the argument goes that obviously NATO will have dominance of the airspace, and hence certain things that are possible now in Ukraine, or certain needs for the unmanned system like the drones and all that, will not be quote unquote needed, or that the Russian capabilities will be struck by the massive airstrikes to the extent where the NATO Russia war will would look different, right? Or so they say, because
So they say. I'm not saying it's an invalid argument, but I think we should be thinking more in terms of scenarios,
Mhm.
different possibilities that will play out in different ways. There's an excellent article out there in Contemporary Security Policy by Monica Sus,
Oh,
saying basically that is a method we should be looking at more because there's more than one future in terms of the possibility that we're seeing. Of course, there is this one possibility where NATO acts cohesively and achieves aerial dominance. And in that case, maybe we're looking at the right plan. But do we really have guarantees that we will actually achieve this aerial dominance? Maybe we're looking at a scenario, and this was told to me in very clear terms by an analyst in Kiev when I was there in August 24. We might also be looking at a scenario in which China recapitalizes the Russian armory, recapitalizes perhaps Russian air defense, Russian long range strike capacity, in case that China sort of decides to really become a threat to the collective West,
mhm.
obviously.
Yeah.
So, what do we do in that case? We cannot count on a scenario in which we will have clear air supremacy, in which we will have something that is obviously different from what is now going on in Ukraine. And we cannot absolutely count on technology remaining unchanged even in the short term.
That's the part of the saying, right? That usually the generals are getting ready for the last war, not the one that is to come, right? That's the gist of it. And also, I would say that the aerial skirmish between India and Pakistan, India using at least some of European equipment, yeah, because they had French Rafales fighting against mostly Chinese equipment, with China providing some intelligence capability for the Pakistanis, yeah, and it didn't look all that great for India, yeah. So in the context of the scenario you're talking about, that definitely makes sense. Um, okay, so. Let's go to another point on our agenda, more political, I would say. So um, Western countries are having more and more turbulent internal politics. We can see it in France. We definitely can see it in Britain, and we also see it in Germany with with the rise of far right populist movements and political parties. So I wanted to ask you, will Alternative for Deutschland be in the next Germany's government after the election? Yeah, is it like a scenario that we can think about, or it's still like just a political fiction? But if we think about this scenario from my country's, from Poland's perspective, would it be like a catastrophe of Trumpian proportions? Right? we still consider Germany as our ally and partner, as a country that is supposed to help us out if things gonna get really bad with the with Russia, right? But with AfD as a part of Germany's government, that wouldn't be that clear cut, right? So what's your opinion on this particular scenario? Yeah? Is it at all possible? And if it, hopefully not, but if it would happen, what would be the consequences?
Important and complex question, right? AfD is now polling at around 25%. That is to say, in some polls, it's the strongest party, stronger than the currently governing CDU. That alone is reason to be skeptical about the stability of German affairs, because, as you hinted at, they're not the only anti-systemic party. There's also the new Sarah Wagenknecht
Mm-hmm.
alliance, which has a weird mix of mostly right-wing but also left-wing positions. And there's also a resurgent party of the left, which is also largely skeptical of the Western Security Alliance, and some parts of which are also friendly to Russia. So the question of domestic resilience is important in a way that it was not during the original Cold War, when all of the Western states basically were following the American New Deal model for a society which was democratic and capitalistic in a certain framework that guaranteed the inclusion of all social strata, and which was essentially a model of society that could be taken for granted as being attractive and stable. And opposition to this basic model of society was always minimal, could never count on any opportunity for destabilizing it, really, despite terrorism, despite some right-wing movements, despite some left-wing movements, but no serious political electoral force could challenge this model. This is now different, right? We're looking at a neoliberal economic model which is becoming increasingly dissociated from parliamentary democracy, which is increasingly being questioned by diffuse visions of a different society, some of which is associated with the techno-futurism driven by people like Elon Musk, some of which is associated with, let's say it clearly, with fascism, which is an important political force in the AfD, for example. So in contrast to the first Cold War, it's not really clear what are we defending in this case. And that is quite dramatic. And while most experts think that we're not going to see more than 25, 26% support for AfD, they have basically exhausted their support. I cannot tell you whether this is actually true because I'm not an electoral expert, but it does appear that this is the support they're going to get. But the actually worrying debate that is underway is the debate within the center-right wing parties, mostly the CDU, whether they have more in common with other democratic parties or whether they should allow a left-right division to take its place. And in that case, they might find it attractive to perhaps enter some sort of tentative agreement with the AfD. At least that is something which is being hinted at by some CDU leaders, but quite important ones, such as, for example, the president of German parliament, Julia Klöckner, has recently said that basically some of the far-right actors were no worse than left-wing actors and so on. So there is a degree of systemic destabilization going. That I
But
think is safe to say.
so okay, so we have this. Let's say this scenario is going forward. Yeah, after the election, CDU is saying, okay, we want to have this left-right divide. Right, it's sensible to make a coalition with AFD. And now, what would it mean for the Germany's foreign policy and how it behaves in like general security milieu of the region? Would you say it would be some paradigmatic shift? Just because AFD is this anti-systemic party, and from Polish perspective, some of their members are saying things that are downright scary, yeah, all the way up to talking about revision of the borders, right? So I can imagine that those are like fringe elements in AFD, but still those voices are raised, right? So would you say that in this scenario, uh, how much there would be of a change in Germany's foreign and security policy?
If it happened, it would be a catastrophe, not so much in terms of possible aggression, because interestingly, the specific brand of right wing politics that AFD represents, they're not really keen on geopolitical competition at the moment. Uh, Interestingly, this one lady, which is well known in Poland, Erika Steinbach, when she
Mm-hmm.
went from CDU to AFD, she actually stopped talking about any German-Polish issues
Really?
because
Okay.
the dominant foreign policy model of AFD right now is passivity, essentially.
As it's a form of isolationism, would you
It
say?
sounds more like isolationism. Of course, you can't count on any of that being serious. And if they actually manage to establish some stable sort of governance, you might be looking at, depending also on the international context in that scenario, you might be looking at a worst case scenario. Of course, I would not count on the sanity or the stability of any of those people, but there would be some warning time, most likely, because a government with the AFD would probably resemble the first Trump administration more than
Okay.
the second.
Mhm.
They would have to figure out how to take over the mechanisms of the state, how to deal with opposition, and their focus in terms of the autocratization which they would try to undertake, their focus would be on internal opposition,
Mhm.
first of all, not any international questions. They might develop that appetite later, but there would be warning time. The
Okay.
real question is, of course, how would that government come about? Very likely the CDU would split over any attempt
Okay.
to
Mm-hmm.
build a government with AFD. Very likely, such a split would be heavily regional because voices which are more tolerant of the AFD, you find those mostly in the East, some parts of the South. You hardly find them at all in the western parts of Germany. So perhaps we're looking at problems that would come up within Germany and not so much in the beginning in its international relations.
Well, but like the raising entropy, yeah, the raising level of problems with collective agency. Because if we are talking about states, we are talking about a lot of people doing stuff together, right? And feeling that they do it for the reason, right? And now, if you have all those divisions and like just nobody understands what to do anymore, right? It means that you can, in a sense, neutralize a state with this sort of like uh, degradation of its political system, you may say, when it comes to joint agency, right? That's the so just a short. What would be your take? How much of it is like genuine German internal political dynamics? Okay, and how much of it is actually a targeted hybrid Russian operation in the information, well, basically psyop, yeah, as they call it. Do you have any feeling for that? What could be the ratio?
It's very difficult to disentangle. It's very difficult to disentangle, partly because some of the actors who spread Russian narratives also genuinely believe in them. So, there are certain studies out there which give numerical quantities on how much online engagement is being driven by Russian bots. And I was once a guest in a talk show, and it appeared that most of the critical comments regarding what I said about Ukraine in that case, that most of those comments were from bots, like they had all of their usernames were first name, last name, 8 digits. So it's very clear what you're talking about there. But in the real world, among actual political debates going on, I think some of those problems are not just consisting of Russian disinformation, but are actually driven by a certain readiness to believe certain parts of narratives, not necessarily the entire Russian narrative. Nobody is going to be talking about the unity of Ukrainian and Russian people. Or that is not something that
It's too far.
people, it's too far out there. That is not something people will believe here. But the general idea that it's a dangerous world out there, you can believe nobody, and it's best to just hunker down and be passive, that is a message that you will find many genuine believers.
In Poland, we have those podcasts, and there is like a podcast Germany in Ruin, right? Lately, there was a book published called Germany Kaput, for example. So I have a feeling that a lot of analysts and like public speakers in Polish discourse, they have this, they try to hide it, but they do not do a great job it, but they are like happy to see that there are problems in Germany, right? Which is, I don't know, which is kind of dumb. I might say that I have a lot of problems with various aspects of German foreign policy over the last 20 years, but like being happy that there are problems with the stability, for example, of internal politics in Germany is just, I don't understand it. But anyway, yeah. So, any good news from Germany, Jochen? Like to say something, optimistic, or something that actually gives hope that the scenario we were talking about is hopefully just political fiction.
It is hopefully political fiction. I think most of those questions can be solved, but some sacred lambs would need to be slaughtered. Like the financial situation of the country is problematic. It is not kaput, but we do need to reduce certain aspects of the pension system. We need to take a hard look at how we collect taxes and so on and so on. And that is not being addressed by political elites who hope that the business model doesn't have to change. The current coalition is very much dominated by that style of thinking. I think that would be a fair criticism. So you want some good news? Well, there are some good news. First, there is still an incredibly capable manufacturing industry in Germany, which will have free capacities due to the drop in demand for internal combustion engine driven vehicles. Right? So there is really a large manufacturing capacity for advanced military technologies, which is becoming available. This can be framed, of course, as bad news because it means economic problems. It can also be framed from a security standpoint as good news because we're having this output of a potentially powerful military technology, which could become an arsenal of democracy for Ukraine, for Poland, and for many other countries. And there is a still very competent defense industry with a long experience in systems integration and so on, which is an experience which is sometimes missing in some of the other alliance countries. So that part of Germany is not kaput and could actually, if the political leadership were available, could be an important factor in the emerging great power competition, especially if we consider that China may play a more aggressive role in arming autocracies vis-a-vis the Western alliance. So no, not everything is broken, and there is a relatively stable majority in German politics for engaging in an active security policy. Doesn't mean that the debate is always well informed or competent. It's a debate that many politicians would rather avoid. We've seen this with the SPD very clearly. We're seeing this more ambiguously now with the CDU. But both big traditional parties are avoiding the hard questions and are polemicizing actively against democratic parties who would like a more active role and a more pronounced debate. But ultimately, those are questions which will need to be answered. And the potential solution is there, and Germany will be able to contribute. And I think that is some good news, which gain in importance if we look at the things that are going on in the United States.
Thank you very much for your insights about that. So the last part on the agenda for our talk is, talking about Poland's and Germany's national interests. Yeah, because the power dynamic in Europe is changing. Yeah, the countries that were formerly in Soviet bloc, they were able to gain a lot of economic material capabilities over last 30 years, right? And if we say that the base determines the superstructure, right? It means that some political changes are due, or are even overdue in Europe. uh, but then again, right, when we talk about, like, for example, I've listened and read some pieces in Poland about how a couple of Mercedes behaviors were like geared towards showing Poland its place. For example, there is this talk about how leaders were going in one cart, yeah, European leaders, and then Polish Prime Minister was going on the other cart of the train. Do you think that Poland and Germany actually have some stable overlap of their, national interests, for the, future, say 10, 20 years, to still be those strategic allies that our countries are supposed to be strategic allies, yeah?
Yeah, yeah. They
Right.
don't always sound like it.
Yeah,
Yeah, they don't always
they
sound
don't
like it.
always sound
Uh,
like it.
Germany has been the non-moving part in this equation too often, unfortunately, and has actively damaged the strategic interests of both countries with its long-standing policy of Wandel durch Handel, which was entirely fictitious, of course. The idea that engaging commercially with Russia would somehow improve the situation there. So that obviously creates very bad looks, and the elites who created those problems are still in power. On the other hand, there is a large majority for getting rid of those policies. There is little sympathy for anybody who would return to a policy of equidistance between the West and Russia outside extremist circles, outside the AfD and BSW. Um, So I would say yes, the strategic interests, so the overlap in strategic interests is there. It just has a very hard time to be articulated. I have the impression this is also difficult in Poland. It is certainly difficult in Germany. And I think that if we emphasize the very basics of geopolitics, the idea that both Germans and Poles want to live as citizens of free republics. And if we emphasize the material necessities that are necessary for that to come about, then we have a good chance of actually seeing through this present crisis and perhaps also having a more agreeable bilateral relationship. But
Okay, Jochen, thank you very much for this conversation. I had a lot of pleasure talking with you. Hopefully, in some time we might also talk a little bit about your current research. So less in the particular, then we can actually less particular stuff, but more academic stuff because I like those talks as well. So once more, thank you very much for your time. It was an awesome conversation, and hopefully it's not the last conversation that we had on the channel.
thank you, Mateusz. Very happy. Talk to you soon. Thanks for having me.